My wedding dress cost more than my parents' flight to Turks and Caicos, and I know that because I was the one who paid for both. I want you to sit with that for a second before I tell you anything else, because it explains everything that came after it. It explains why I didn't scream when I read the text. It explains why I smiled at 300 people who had flown in from 4 different states while 2 chairs in my front row sat empty and folded and white and cruel. It explains why, 6 months later, I would be the one holding a folder of bank statements instead of a bouquet, and why that folder would end up matching more than any flower arrangement I ever chose. My name is Nora Ellison. I was 32 years old on the day my parents decided that my sister's crisis was more important than my wedding, and I want to tell you, before anything else, that I did not find out from a phone call. I found out from a text message, sent at 11:40 in the morning, while I was standing in a small side room off the main hall of a restored barn venue in the hills outside town, wearing a dress with 42 tiny buttons up the back that my mother had helped me choose 8 months earlier, back when she still cared enough to have opinions about lace. The text said, and I have read it enough times now that I could recite it in my sleep, "Change of plans, sweetheart. We will celebrate properly when we are back. Kayla needs us right now. We know you understand. We know you understand." That was the part that did it. Not the missing wedding. The certainty in it. The assumption baked so deep into 4 words that my mother didn't even feel the need to ask if I understood, only to tell me that I did, the way you'd inform a coworker that a meeting had been moved, not the way you'd speak to a daughter on the morning of her wedding. I want to back up, though, because a story like this doesn't start with a text message. It starts 32 years earlier, with 2 daughters born 4 years apart into a house that ran, quietly and completely, on the idea that one of us was fine and one of us wasn't. I was the fine one. I want to say that without bitterness, because for most of my life I believed it was true, and being fine felt like a compliment. I got good grades without anyone standing over me. I got a scholarship to study structural engineering, which is a way of saying I spent my 20s learning exactly how much weight something can carry before the cracks start, which, if you want irony, you can have that one for free, because nobody in my family ever thought to ask how much weight I was carrying, since I never showed the cracks. My sister Kayla was the one who wasn't fine, and I want to be careful here, because I loved her, I still love her, and this isn't a story about a villain wearing my sister's face. Kayla struggled in ways that were real. She changed majors 3 times. She left a relationship that had genuinely frightened our parents. She lost jobs, not from laziness but from a kind of chronic bad luck that seemed to follow her the way good luck seemed to follow me, and our parents responded to that imbalance the way a lot of parents do, by trying to even the scales, except they never told anyone they were doing it, and they never stopped. I didn't know, not really, not with numbers attached, how much evening the scales had cost. I want you to remember that, because it becomes important later. I knew there had been help given to Kayla over the years. I did not know the shape of it, or the size of it, or where, specifically, it had come from. My grandmother, my mother's mother, a woman named Vivian who smelled like peppermint and kept a coffee can of loose buttons on her windowsill for no reason anyone ever explained, died when I was 27. She left behind a modest trust, built slowly over 40 years of small, stubborn saving, meant to be split evenly between her 2 granddaughters when the time came. She named me trustee, not because she loved me more, she told me once, near the end, but because she trusted me to be fair even when fairness was inconvenient. I signed papers I barely read at the time, because I was 27 and grieving, and my mother handled most of the logistics, and the account sat there, mostly, for years, doing what trust accounts do, which is exist quietly until somebody needs them. I am telling you all of this now, in order, because I need you to understand that I walked into my own wedding day as a person who believed she knew her family's whole shape. I thought I understood the weight distribution. I did not know yet that a support beam had been slowly, invisibly failing for 4 years, 20 feet above my head, while I stood underneath it, smiling, holding up a roof I didn't know was already cracking. 3 weeks before the wedding, I called my parents to confirm arrival times, hotel blocks, the small mechanical details of the day. My mother was warm on that call, warmer than she'd been in months, and she said, more than once, that she couldn't wait, that Frank had already picked out his tie, that it was going to be perfect. I believed her completely, because there was no reason not to. 2 days before the wedding, she called again, and her voice had a different texture to it, breathless in a way I recognized from childhood, the specific pitch she used when something involving Kayla had gone wrong. Kayla, she told me, was in crisis. Not a vague, general crisis, but something urgent, something financial, something that apparently could not wait even 48 hours, and my parents needed to fly to Turks and Caicos immediately, that same week, to help her handle it in person. I remember standing in my kitchen, phone against my ear, looking at a garment bag hanging on the back of the door that held my dress, and I remember the strange, calm clarity that came over me, the same clarity I get on a job site when I notice a hairline crack in a beam that everyone else has walked past for weeks. I offered to help. I offered money, immediately, no hesitation, because that has always been my instinct, fix the visible problem first, ask questions later. I offered to handle whatever it was after the wedding, in 2 days, when I would have time and attention to actually be useful. My mother said, gently, in the voice she has used on me my entire life, the voice that has always made refusal feel unkind, that Kayla needed them there, in person, not money, not phone calls, that some things you can't fix from far away, and that I would understand. I always understood, I was good like that. I want you to notice something with me, because it took me longer to notice than it should have. She never asked if I understood. She told me I did, the same way she would tell me, 2 days later, in a text message, we know you understand, as though my understanding were a fixed feature of my personality rather than a choice I was making, over and over, every single time, to swallow something so the peace could stay unbroken. I said okay. I want to be honest with you, because this story only works if I am. I did not fight. I did not demand. I hung up the phone, and I sat down at my kitchen table, and I felt something I didn't have a name for yet, something quieter than anger and heavier than sadness, and then I got up and I finished sewing a loose button on my mother's cardigan, the one she was supposed to wear to the rehearsal dinner, because that is who I was on that Tuesday. A woman who fixes things for people who are about to leave her standing alone. The wedding day itself started early and beautifully. My best friend Priya did my hair in the little side room while sunlight came through a window that had been left slightly open, and for those first 2 hours I was, genuinely, happy. My husband, though I didn't have the right to call him that yet, David, texted me a photo of his shoes with the caption "These better be worth $300, and I laughed out loud, alone, in a room full of white flowers, and for those 2 hours I forgot to check my phone for anyone else. At 11:40, the text came in. Change of plans, sweetheart. I read it 3 times before it fully landed, the way your body sometimes understands a fall before your brain catches up to the ground. Priya was behind me, working a pin into my hair, and she must have felt something shift in my shoulders because she asked what was wrong before I'd said a single word. I told her. I said it flatly, the way you'd report a fact rather than a wound. My parents aren't coming, Kayla has some kind of emergency, they're already at the airport. Priya went very still behind me, and then she said something I will remember for the rest of my life. She said, Nora, look at me, and when I did, she said, you are not going to fall apart in this dress, not today, we will feel every bit of this tomorrow, together, but today you are going to walk down that aisle like the woman David is lucky enough to be marrying, and I am going to stand right here until you're ready. I did not fall apart. I want that on the record, clearly, because for a long time after that day I believed my calm was a kind of weakness, evidence that I had trained myself too well to absorb disappointment without complaint. I understand it differently now. My calm that day was not submission. It was the first small brick in something I would spend the next several months building, though I didn't know it yet. I walked out of that side room at 11:55, 4 minutes before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, and I stood at the back of the barn, behind 200 white chairs, and I looked down the length of the aisle to the front row, where 2 chairs, my parents' chairs, sat empty, ribboned, waiting for people who were somewhere over the Atlantic by then, worrying about a daughter who wasn't me. The coordinator touched my elbow gently and asked if I was ready, and I remember looking at her and saying yes, in a voice that came out steadier than I felt, Because 32 years of practice does that to you. It teaches your voice to hold weight your chest can't. I want to tell you what happened next, because it is the first moment in this story where someone chose me without being asked to, and it broke something open in me that I didn't expect. My father-in-law, David's father, a quiet, sturdy man named Ray Reyes, who had lost his own wife 6 years earlier and walked with a slight limp from an old knee injury, stepped forward from where he'd been standing near the doorway. He didn't make a speech about it. He didn't announce anything to the room. He simply held out his arm, the way you'd offer someone a hand crossing uneven ground, and he said, low enough that only I could hear it, "You don't walk this alone today, not on my watch." I took his arm. I walked most of that aisle on the arm of a man who had buried his own wife and still had it in him, on a random Saturday in June, to notice an empty chair and quietly fill the gap it left, without needing credit for it, without needing anyone to clap. I have thought about that moment more times than I can count in the months since, because it was the first piece of evidence I had that family, real family, isn't always the people who share your blood. Sometimes it's the man who steps forward when the people who were supposed to be there aren't. The ceremony itself was beautiful, and I mean that honestly, not as a performance of gratitude. David cried when he saw me, which he had sworn for weeks he would not do, and our vows were simple and specific to us, full of small private jokes about blueprints and load calculations that made our friends laugh and made David's mother wipe her eyes with a tissue she'd tucked into her sleeve for exactly that purpose. For 20 minutes, standing across from him, I forgot the empty chairs entirely. It was the reception where the absence started to grow teeth. I gave a toast that night, a short one, thanking our friends for traveling, thanking David's parents for treating me like a daughter from the very first dinner I ever had with them, thanking Priya for holding me together in more ways than one. I did not mention my parents. I want to be honest, it wasn't a calculated snub in the moment, it was simpler and sadder than that. I genuinely could not think of a single true, warm thing to say about two people who had chosen an airport over my wedding, and I was not willing to lie in front of 300 people on the best day of my life. Several guests noticed. My Aunt Carol, my mother's older sister, found me near the dessert table later and asked, carefully, delicately, if everything was all right with my parents, and I told her the truth in as few words as I could manage. They had a family emergency, they had to leave, and Carol's face did something complicated, something that told me she already knew more than she was saying, though I wouldn't understand what for weeks. At 9 that evening, in the middle of the dancing, I slipped away to the small bathroom off the barn's side hallway, locked the door, sat down on the closed lid of the toilet in my 42-button dress, and I cried, hard and fast and silent, for exactly 4 minutes. I know it was 4 minutes because I watched the second hand on my watch the entire time, an old habit from job sites, where you learn to give yourself permission to feel something completely and then put it away so you can keep working. When the 4 minutes were up, I fixed my mascara with a tissue Priya had thoughtfully tucked into my clutch that morning, and I walked back out into the reception, and I danced with my husband, and nobody who saw me in that room would have known that 20 minutes earlier I had been sitting on a toilet lid grieving two people who were, at that exact moment, somewhere over open water, thinking about someone else's problems. Late that night, after the last guests had gone and David and I sat on the floor of our hotel suite in our wedding clothes, too tired to change, opening the small stack of cards our guests had left behind, I found one addressed in my mother's handwriting, postmarked 4 days earlier, mailed before she'd even left for the airport. Inside was a generic card, the kind you'd buy for a coworker's baby shower on your lunch break. Congratulations on your special day, love Mom and Dad. No mention of David by name, no mention of anything specific to us at all. I sat there holding it for a long time, and David didn't say anything. He just put his hand on my back and let me hold it as long as I needed to. I want to end this chapter here, on that hotel room floor, because that was the last night I spent as the daughter who simply absorbed things. I didn't know it yet. I thought I was just tired, and hurt, and married, all at the same time, in a way that felt too complicated to sort through before morning. I put the card down on the nightstand, and I looked at David, and I said, out loud, for the first time, I don't think I understand anymore. He asked me what I meant. I told him I'd spent my whole life being told I understood things I had never actually agreed to understand, and that something about today had finally made the difference visible to me, sharp as a hairline crack under fresh paint, and that I didn't know yet what I was going to do about it, but I knew I was done pretending the crack wasn't there. David didn't try to fix it that night. He just held my hand on top of the hotel comforter and said, "Whatever you need to do, I'm not going anywhere," and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I believed, completely, that someone meant that. I fell asleep that night still wearing traces of my wedding makeup, in a room full of unopened gifts and one very ordinary card, and I did not yet know about the 4 years of trust withdrawals waiting for me in a filing cabinet I hadn't opened since my grandmother's funeral. I did not know that my sister's crisis wasn't really about a vacation at all. I did not know that the man who would eventually help me trace it all back to its source was already, at that very moment, running a scheme that would touch my family in ways none of us could have predicted. I only knew one thing clearly, lying there in the dark beside my husband. I was done being the daughter who understood. Whatever came next, I was going to be the woman who asked why. The morning after my wedding, I woke up before David did, still in the hotel robe I'd put on sometime around 2 in the morning, and I sat by the window with a lukewarm cup of coffee and my phone in my hand, waiting for it to ring. It did not ring. That is the detail I want to start with, because in every version of this story I imagined as a little girl, watching other families and movies, a fight like this always ended in a phone call, someone crying, someone apologizing, someone driving through the night to make it right. My parents did not call the morning after they missed my wedding. They sent a photo instead, 3 days later, of a sunset over turquoise water, captioned "Having a lovely time, hope the wedding was everything you dreamed," and I sat there on my honeymoon, in a rented cottage overlooking a lake David had booked for us months earlier, staring at a picture of a sunset that belonged to a life I hadn't been invited into. I did not respond to that message for 2 full days, which was, for me, an act of rebellion so small it would be invisible to anyone who didn't know how I operated. I have always responded to my mother within the hour. Always. It was a rule I had never written down but had followed my entire adult life, the way you follow the load rating on a bridge without ever reading the sign, just because you know the number by heart. 2 days of silence felt, to me, like standing at the edge of a roof. When I finally answered, I kept it short. I wrote back, "Glad you're having a good time," and nothing else, no warmth, no forgiveness offered in advance, and I remember David watching me type it from across the cottage kitchen, not saying anything, just watching my face the way you watch someone handling something sharp for the first time. We came home from the honeymoon on a Sunday, and by Tuesday I was back at my firm, back in steel-toed boots and a hard hat, walking a job site downtown where we were reinforcing the foundation of a 100-year-old building that had developed a lean nobody wanted to admit was structural. I want to tell you something about my job, because it matters more to this story than you might expect. My entire profession is built on a single, unglamorous truth, which is that things fail slowly, long before they fail visibly, and that the people who catch problems early are never the ones who get thanked, because by the time anyone notices, the failure has usually already been prevented. Nobody throws a parade for the engineer who found the crack before the wall came down. You only get attention for the wall that falls. I bring this up because 2 weeks after my wedding, sitting at my desk during a lunch break, reviewing an unrelated file for a client, I had a thought that arrived with the same quiet, cold clarity I get on a job site right before I flag something dangerous. I thought about my grandmother's trust. I thought about the fact that I had signed papers as trustee 5 years earlier and had not, in all that time, ever actually pulled the transaction history. I had trusted my mother's summary of things, the way you trust a contractor's word instead of pulling the permits yourself, and for the first time in my adult life, that trust felt less like faith and more like negligence. I called the bank that afternoon. I want you to understand that this was not, in my mind, an act of suspicion yet. I told myself I simply wanted to review the account now that the wedding chaos was behind me, a housekeeping task, nothing more. The woman on the phone, a patient, thorough bank representative named Teresa, told me the full statement history would take a few business days to compile given the account's age, and I said that was fine, and I hung up, and I went back to my meeting about foundation reinforcement, and I did not think about it again for 4 days, because I genuinely did not expect to find anything. The documents arrived on a Thursday evening, a thick manila envelope, and I remember sitting down at my kitchen table with a glass of wine I never finished, spreading the pages out the way I'd spread blueprints across a site trailer, looking for the story the numbers were telling before I let myself feel anything about it. The first withdrawal I found was small, $1,100, 4 years earlier, coded in the bank's internal notes as Kayla, family assistance. I remember exhaling, almost relieved, because $1,100 felt survivable, forgivable even, the kind of thing you help a struggling sibling with and never think twice about. Then I found the second withdrawal, 3 months later, $2,200, same code. Then a third. Then a fourth. By the time I reached the bottom of the third page, I had stopped feeling relieved and started feeling the specific, focused stillness that comes right before you realize a number is much bigger than you thought it was. I got a legal pad from the drawer by the stove, the same drawer where I keep spare batteries and rubber bands, and I started a column. I added every withdrawal coded to Kayla, in order, going back 4 years, and when I finished, when I set my pen down and looked at the total sitting at the bottom of the page, it read $41,300. I sat in my kitchen for a long time after that, David upstairs on a work call, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator, and I felt something shift in my chest that I can only describe as the sound a beam makes right before it gives, not a crash, just a long, low groan that tells you everything is about to change. $41,000 was not a loan given once, in a genuine emergency, the way I had always assumed. It was a pattern. It was 4 years of quiet, repeated withdrawals from an account that was legally half mine, taken without my knowledge, without my signature, without a single conversation in which anyone asked whether I agreed. My grandmother had named me trustee specifically because she trusted me to be fair, and for 4 years, fairness had been happening without me in the room. I did not call my mother that night. I want to be honest about why, because it matters. It wasn't restraint, not entirely. It was that I didn't trust my own voice yet, and I have never been someone who confronts people before I understand exactly what I'm confronting them with. I have watched buildings get demolished because someone acted on a hunch instead of a survey, and I was not going to make that mistake with my own family. I spent the next several days building the file properly. I requested the full digital statement history going back to the account's opening, cross-referenced every withdrawal against dates I could verify, and started noticing a pattern within the pattern, which was almost worse than the original discovery. The withdrawals were not evenly spaced. They spiked, every single time, around dates that, when I checked my own calendar archives and old text threads, corresponded almost exactly to moments when Kayla had mentioned some kind of setback. A car repair. A deposit lost on an apartment that fell through. A business idea that needed startup capital. Each time, within a week or two, another withdrawal appeared, coded the same tired way, family assistance, as though 4 words could explain away 4 years of decisions made entirely without me. The following Sunday, my mother called, and for the first time since the wedding, I let myself actually think, clearly, about what I wanted to say before I picked up. I had spent the week practicing something I was not naturally good at, which was speaking to my mother without softening every sentence in advance to protect her feelings before my own had even been spoken. She was warm on the phone, the way she always was when enough time had passed that she believed a wound had scarred over. She asked about the honeymoon, about the pictures I'd posted, and I let her talk for a few minutes before I said, as evenly as I could manage, I pulled the trust statements this week. There was a pause on the line, small, almost nothing, the kind of pause you'd miss if you weren't listening for it, and then she said, "Oh, is everything all right with the account?" I told her I had questions about some of the withdrawals. I did not accuse her of anything yet. I asked, simply, if she could walk me through what the $41,000 over 4 years had actually gone toward, because the notes only said family assistance, and I wanted to understand the full picture before I did anything with the account. The silence that followed was longer this time, long enough that I heard, faintly, my father's voice in the background asking who was on the phone, and my mother's hand covering the receiver, muffled words I couldn't make out, and then her voice came back, careful now, threaded with something I hadn't heard from her before, which was fear. She said, "Nora, honey, I think this is a conversation better had in person. I told her I disagreed. I told her, and I remember my own voice staying level in a way that surprised even me, that I was the trustee, legally responsible for that account, and that as far as I understood it, I had every right to a clear accounting of where the money had gone, in person or otherwise, and that I would rather have the conversation now, over the phone, than wait for a moment that kept getting postponed. My mother, for the first time in my entire adult life, did not have a smooth answer ready. She said Kayla had been through a lot, that some of it wasn't hers to explain, that I would understand once I knew the full story, and there it was again, that word, understand, deployed the way it always had been, as a request disguised as a certainty. I said, quietly, I don't think I do understand, actually, not anymore, and I would like someone to explain it to me properly instead of assuming I will accept it the way I always have. She said she needed to talk to my father, and that she would call me back, and she hung up before I could say anything else, which was, in its own way, its own kind of answer. I sat at my kitchen table after that call for a long time, the legal pad still open in front of me, $41,300 circled twice in blue ink, and David came downstairs and found me there and sat across from me without saying anything at first, just reading my face the way he'd learned to over the past year, and then he asked, gently, what do you need right now? I told him I needed to understand what I was actually looking at before I let myself feel anything else about it, because the version of me that had spent 32 years absorbing disappointment quietly was not going to be useful for what came next, and I could feel, even then, sitting in my kitchen with cold coffee and a stack of bank statements, that something in me had permanently shifted, the way a structure shifts after the first real stress test, not broken, not yet, but never quite the same shape it was before. 3 days later, my mother called back, not with an explanation, but with a request. She asked if David and I could come to dinner that Friday, all of us, Kayla included, so we could, in her words, clear the air properly as a family. I agreed, mostly because I wanted to see all of their faces in the same room when the numbers came up, and partly because some old, tired part of me still hoped, even then, that there would be a good reason, a reason that would make the ache in my chest make sense. I did not yet know that the dinner would be the night everything I thought I understood about my family would finally, completely, come apart, and that the woman who walked into that house on Friday evening would not be the same woman who walked back out of it. Kayla was already crying by the time we sat down at the table, and I remember thinking, before anyone had said a single word about money, that she had learned to cry the way some people learn to play an instrument, early, and well, and without ever quite realizing when the performance stopped being separate from the feeling underneath it. My parents' dining room looked exactly the way it always had, the same amber light fixture hanging low over the same oak table, the same chipped gravy boat my mother refused to replace because it had been my grandmother's, and I remember sitting down in my usual chair, the one I had occupied at that table since I was old enough to sit in a big chair at all, and feeling, for the first time in my life, like a guest in a house that used to be mine. David sat beside me, quiet, present, his hand resting lightly on my knee under the table, not gripping, just there, a small anchor I hadn't asked for but was grateful for anyway. My father sat at the head of the table, carving a roast chicken he had clearly overcooked in his nervousness, and my mother moved between the kitchen and the table in that brisk, busy way she always did when she wanted to avoid sitting still long enough for a real conversation to start. I let them get through 15 minutes of small talk before I set my fork down and said, gently but plainly, I'd like to talk about the trust now, if that's all right. The room went quiet in a way that felt almost physical, the kind of quiet that has weight to it, and my father set down the carving knife, and my mother finally sat, and Kayla, who had not looked at me directly since I'd walked in the door, wrapped both hands around her water glass like it was the only solid thing left in the room. I laid it out plainly, the way I would present findings on a job site, no accusation in my voice, just facts. I told them I had pulled 4 years of statements. I told them the total came to $41,300, all coded the same way, all withdrawn without my knowledge or signature, despite my name being the one legally attached to the account as trustee. I told them I wasn't there to punish anyone. I told them I simply wanted the truth, finally, in full, instead of pieces handed to me one soft excuse at a time. My mother spoke first, and her voice had a practiced quality to it that told me she had rehearsed this in the car, in the shower, in the quiet moments before I arrived. She said Kayla had been struggling for years in ways I didn't fully see because I was always so steady, so capable, and that every withdrawal had felt, at the time, like the only option available: a car that needed fixing so Kayla could keep her job, a deposit lost when a landlord backed out unfairly, small emergencies that stacked, quietly, into something large only in hindsight. I asked why none of it had ever gone through me, given that I was the one whose name was legally on the account. My father answered that one, and his voice was rougher, less rehearsed, closer to the truth than my mother's had been. He said they hadn't wanted to burden me. He said I had always handled my own life so well that it felt unfair to ask me to also manage Kayla's, that involving me would have meant admitting, out loud, how bad things had actually gotten, and that admitting it to me, specifically, felt harder than admitting it to a bank statement neither of them expected me to ever read. I sat with that for a moment, because underneath the excuse there was something almost like an answer, and I wanted to be fair enough to hear it. I said, quietly, so asking me would have meant treating me like family instead of like a solution, and my father didn't answer that, which was, in its own way, an answer. Kayla finally spoke, and her voice cracked in the way it always had since we were children, a crack that used to make me rush to fix whatever was breaking her before I even understood the problem. She said she never meant for it to become what it became. She said the first withdrawal really had been an emergency, and after that, once she knew the money was there, it became easier every time to ask again instead of solving things on her own, and she was ashamed, she said, more ashamed than she'd ever told anyone, because some small part of her had known, every single time, that it wasn't really her money to be spending. I asked her, as gently as I could manage, what the money currently funding our parents' trip had actually been for, because the story I'd been given was vague: a crisis, an emergency, nothing specific enough to explain a sudden transatlantic flight 2 days before my wedding. Kayla's hands tightened around her glass, and she looked, for the first time all evening, directly at me, and she said she had invested her savings, most of it, into a resort development in Turks and Caicos, a beachfront property being sold to early investors at a discounted rate before public listing, and that 2 weeks earlier, she had learned the deposit deadline for the next phase of funding had been moved up without warning, and that if she didn't wire an additional amount within days, she would lose everything she had already put in. I asked who had vetted the investment. The question landed harder than I expected it to, not because it was aggressive, but because nobody at that table had an answer. Kayla said a friend from an old job had introduced her to the opportunity. She said the paperwork looked professional. She said the man running it, someone named Marcus Doyle, had shown her renderings, floor plans, a website with drone footage of the property, testimonials from other early investors who had already seen returns. I felt something in my chest tighten, not yet suspicion in any specific direction, just the old, familiar instinct I get on a site when a contractor shows me a beautiful set of plans and I still, out of habit, ask to see the permits. I asked if she had ever seen the actual property, in person, before investing. She said no. She said the trip her parents were currently on was meant to finally do that, to see the site with their own eyes and try to salvage what could still be salvaged, and that they hadn't told me any of this before the wedding because they didn't want to worry me with something that wasn't fully confirmed yet, and because, my mother added quietly, they knew exactly how it would look, missing my wedding for a business trip disguised as a family emergency. I sat back in my chair, and for a long moment nobody said anything, the only sound in the room the tick of the old clock above the sideboard that had ticked the same way through every dinner of my childhood. I said, finally, so you missed my wedding to try and rescue an investment none of you have actually verified as real. Nobody answered that directly, which told me everything. I want to tell you what happened in me in that silence, because it was the moment rock bottom actually arrived, not as a single collapse but as a slow, complete recognition. I had spent my whole life being the daughter who was fine, which had, without my ever agreeing to it, become the daughter who paid for other people's emergencies without being told the truth about what they were. I looked around that table at 3 people I loved, genuinely loved, and I understood, clearly, for the first time, that being loved and being valued were not the same thing, and that I had spent 32 years mistaking one for the other. I did not raise my voice. I want that on the record, because there is a version of this story where I stand up and scream, where I throw the gravy boat, where I say something cruel enough to make everyone at that table feel the way I had felt standing in my wedding dress reading a text message about a vacation. I did not do that. What I did instead was quieter, and in its own way, harder. I told them I would be freezing further distributions from the trust, effective immediately, using my authority as trustee, until I had a complete, documented understanding of every withdrawal that had ever been made, and until any future funds requested came with an actual explanation, in writing, before the money moved rather than after. My mother's face went pale. She said, "But they're in Turks and Caicos right now, Nora, they need funds to cover the hotel, the flights back. If you freeze the account now you're stranding your own parents." I felt the old instinct rise in me immediately, the reflex to soften, to apologize, to find a workaround that would make everyone comfortable again, and I want you to know how close I came to giving in right there, at that table, because 32 years of practice does not disappear in a single dinner. But I thought about the empty chairs at my wedding. I thought about a card mailed 4 days early, signed the way you'd sign a card for a stranger. I thought about $41,000 spent without ever once asking my name to be on the conversation, only on the account. I said I was sorry they were in that position, and I meant it, genuinely, because I have never once in my life wanted my family to suffer. But I told them that from now on, decisions about that account would not be made silently, on my behalf, without me, ever again, and that if they needed emergency funds to get home, I would help them personally, from my own accounts, as their daughter, but that the trust itself would remain frozen until I understood exactly what it had already paid for. My father, who had said very little all evening, finally looked up from his plate and said, quietly, "You've changed." I told him I hadn't changed. I told him I had simply stopped absorbing things silently, and that the difference between those two things had apparently been invisible to everyone at that table for over 30 years, because silence had always been so convenient for everyone except me. Kayla started crying harder then, and my mother reached for her hand instead of mine, an old reflex so automatic it barely registered as a choice, and I watched it happen, and for the first time it didn't hurt the way it always had. It clarified something instead. I understood, sitting at that table, that I could keep waiting my whole life for my mother's hand to reach for mine first, or I could accept, finally, completely, that some hands simply reach where they've always reached, out of habit, not out of malice, and that the only thing I could actually control was whether I kept setting myself on fire to keep a house warm that had never once checked if I was cold. David and I left shortly after that, and in the car, in the quiet dark of the driveway, he asked if I was all right, and I told him something true, something I hadn't expected to feel that night. I told him I felt sad, and I felt sure, both at the same time, and that I had never known those two feelings could exist together without canceling each other out. He drove us home slowly, taking the longer route along the river the way he always did when he could tell I needed a few extra minutes before walking back into ordinary life, and somewhere on that dark road, without either of us saying much, I felt something settle in my chest that I would need in the days ahead, a kind of steadiness that didn't come from anger, but from finally, fully, believing that I deserved better than to keep understanding my way through my own disappearance. I did not know yet, sitting in that car, that the name Marcus Doyle would become the thread that unraveled far more than a family dinner. I did not know that somewhere in an old case file at my firm, a name very close to his was already sitting, tied to a project I had flagged as unsafe 2 years earlier, before it quietly disappeared from public record. I only knew, pulling into our driveway that night, that I was done waiting for permission to matter in my own family, and that whatever came next, I would be the one deciding the terms. Marcus Doyle had a voice made for exactly this kind of thing, warm, unhurried, the voice of a man who had learned that people trust confidence more than they trust evidence, and I heard it for the first time 2 days after that dinner, when Kayla finally agreed to let me sit in on a call with him, ostensibly so I could understand the investment better before deciding whether the trust would ever fund another cent of it. I want to tell you, before anything else, what I did in the days between that dinner and this call, because it matters. I did not sit still. I have never been someone who sits still once a problem has a shape, and by the time I dialed into that call, speakerphone on, legal pad open in front of me the way it always is on a site inspection, I had already spent 2 full evenings doing something none of my family had apparently thought to do at any point over the past year, which was research. I pulled public records on the resort development Kayla had invested in. I searched the property address against county zoning filings in Turks and Caicos, cross-referenced against international development databases my firm has access to for due diligence on overseas partnerships, and found, within an hour, the first small crack in the story. The parcel of land listed in Kayla's investment paperwork was zoned for residential use, not commercial resort development, and no permit application matching the project's name existed in any public filing I could locate. I did not tell Kayla this before the call. I wanted to hear what Marcus Doyle would say when asked directly, because I have learned, in my line of work, that the fastest way to find a structural problem is to ask a specific question and watch how badly someone avoids answering it. He was good, I'll give him that. When I introduced myself as the trust's fiduciary and asked, plainly, for the zoning documentation and permit numbers associated with the development, he laughed, warm and easy, and said the local permitting process moved slowly in the islands, that paperwork often lagged behind construction by months, that early investors were always the most nervous and always ended up the happiest once the resort opened its doors. He had an answer for everything, smooth and unbothered, the kind of answer that would have satisfied me completely a year earlier, before a wedding day taught me to stop accepting reassurance in place of proof. I asked him for the name of the general contractor of record. He hesitated, just slightly, just long enough for me to hear it, and then gave a name I didn't recognize yet, though I would recognize it very soon. I thanked him for his time. I did not accuse him of anything on that call, because accusation without proof is just noise, and I have spent my whole career learning that noise convinces no one, only evidence does. I told him I would be in touch once I'd reviewed the documentation he promised to send, and I hung up, and Kayla looked at me across the kitchen table with an expression I hadn't seen on her face in years, something close to fear, but not fear of me. She asked, quietly, "Do you think it's real?" I told her the truth, because she deserved that much finally, from someone. I told her I didn't know yet, but that everything about the way he answered questions reminded me of every unsafe job site I'd ever walked onto where the paperwork was somehow always almost ready, always just behind schedule, always one signature away from existing. I want to pause the story here for a moment, because something was happening quietly, underneath all of this, that I hadn't planned for and didn't expect. David had been present for nearly every part of this, not steering it, never once telling me what to do, but simply there, consistently, in a way that felt entirely new to me. He sat beside me during that call, not saying a word, just present, and when it ended he didn't ask if I was alright the way people ask when they want reassurance for themselves. He asked what I needed next, like my next move was already something worth taking seriously. That night, after Kayla had gone home, David found me at the kitchen table with my laptop open, cross-referencing the contractor's name against old project files from my firm, and he sat down across from me with 2 cups of tea he'd made without asking, and he said something I have carried with me since. He said, "Watching you do this, watching you take something that hurt you and turn it into something this precise, this careful, it's the most yourself I think I've ever seen you." I want to explain why that mattered so much, because it would be easy to hear it as a small, sweet thing said between 2 tired people at a kitchen table, and it was that, but it was also more. My whole life, being careful, being precise, being the one who noticed the crack before anyone else did, had been treated by my family as a kind of convenience, a trait that made me easy to lean on and easy to overlook in the same breath. David was the first person who had ever looked at that exact quality and called it beautiful instead of useful. I told him that. I told him, sitting there at midnight with cold tea going colder, that I had spent my whole life being loved for what I could carry, and that I didn't fully know, until him, what it felt like to be loved for who I was underneath the carrying. He reached across the table and took my hand, and he didn't say anything grand back, he just said, "I know," and somehow that landed heavier and warmer than anything more elaborate could have. The contractor's name Marcus Doyle had given me was Halloway Coastal Developments, and it took me 2 days of digging through old firm archives to place why it felt familiar. It came to me on a Thursday afternoon, standing in the archive room at work, pulling a physical file from a cabinet that hadn't been opened in over a year, a project from 2 years earlier, a proposed beachfront development my firm had been asked to consult on before it collapsed under what was, at the time, described vaguely as funding irregularities. I remembered that project. I remembered it specifically because I had been the engineer who flagged it, 2 years earlier, for unsafe permit shortcuts, foundation work that didn't match submitted plans, load calculations that had clearly been altered after the fact to pass inspection faster. I remembered a man, mid-conversation during a site visit, offering, casually, almost like a joke, to make the whole approval process easier for our firm if we were willing to sign off a little faster than our standards usually allowed. I had reported him. The project had been quietly shelved. I had never learned his name at the time, only his role, but the company listed as general contractor on that old file was the same name Marcus Doyle had just given me over the phone. I sat down on the floor of that archive room, files spread around me, and felt something click into place with the particular, cold satisfaction of finding the exact point where a structure had actually failed, not where it appeared to fail. This was not a new scam wearing a new name. This was the same operation, rebuilt, relocated, running the same shortcuts on new victims, and my sister was one of them, and my parents had flown across an ocean, missing my wedding, to hand more money to a man I had already tried to stop once before. I called David from the archive room, and I remember my voice shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the strange, electric mixture of anger and vindication that comes from realizing you were right about something dangerous long before anyone believed you needed to be. That evening, we sat together and mapped it all out on a whiteboard David had, half joking, bought years earlier for what he called our future home office, and it became, that night, something much more serious, covered in names and dates and dollar amounts, Marcus Doyle connected by a single confident line to Holloway Coastal Developments, connected by another line to the shelved project from 2 years earlier, connected finally, at the bottom, to a dollar figure that included not just Kayla's savings, but likely, based on the pattern, several other investors none of us had names for yet. David stood back from the whiteboard at one point, arms crossed, studying it the way he studies a difficult problem at his own job, and he said, quietly, "You know this isn't just about your family anymore." I told him I knew. I told him that somewhere out there were other Kaylas, other people who had handed their savings to a man with a warm voice and a beautiful set of renderings, and that I had a chance, now, to do something my job had trained me for better than almost anything else, to find the failure point before more of the structure came down. I want to be honest about something else that happened that week, something quieter, something that didn't have anything to do with fraud or trusts or contractors. My relationship with David had always been steady, easy in the way good things sometimes are without announcing themselves as remarkable. But watching him those weeks, watching him show up without needing to be asked, hold the whiteboard marker steady while I thought out loud, bring me tea I hadn't asked for at exactly the moment I needed it, I understood something about love that nobody in my family had ever modeled for me. I understood that being chosen, consistently, quietly, without condition, was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the entire thing. One night that week, lying in bed, unable to sleep, I told him about the 4 minutes I'd spent crying in that bathroom on our wedding day, timed on my watch, contained on purpose. I hadn't told him the full detail of it before, the counting, the discipline of it, because it had embarrassed me slightly, how mechanical my own grief had become. He was quiet for a long moment after I told him, and then he said, "You don't have to time it anymore, you know, not with me," and something in my chest that had been braced for over 30 years finally, quietly, let go. By the end of that week, I had what I needed. I had the zoning records. I had the connection to the shelved project. I had a name, Marcus Doyle, and a company, Holloway Coastal Developments, tied together across 2 years and at least 2 states, and I had, sitting in my email, a message from a fraud investigator named Priya's brother had connected me with, a man named Elias Cho, who specialized in exactly this kind of overseas investment scheme and who, after reviewing the file I sent him, wrote back within a day with 4 words that told me everything. "This is bigger," he wrote, "than one investor." I sat with that message for a long time before I told anyone else, because I understood, sitting there, that I was no longer simply the daughter who had been left behind on her wedding day. I was, for the first time in my life, standing at the exact center of something that mattered, not because I had been asked to be there, but because I had refused, finally, to stay quietly on the outside of my own family's decisions. I called my mother the next morning, and I told her, calmly, that I had found something she needed to know before her and my father flew home, and for the first time since the wedding, her voice on the other end of the line was not warm, was not smooth, was simply, completely, afraid. My mother's voice, when she finally spoke, sounded smaller than I had ever heard it, and she asked me, quietly, if this was the part where I stopped loving them. I told her no. I told her, sitting at my kitchen table with Elias Cho's email still open on my laptop screen, that this was not about love ending, it was about the truth finally arriving, and that those had never actually been the same thing, no matter how many years our family had spent treating them as though they were. I asked her and my father to come home immediately, not for another confrontation, but because I had information that could help them recover what was left of their money, and because Kayla deserved to hear it from me directly, in person, not filtered through a phone call from an island 3,000 miles away. My mother agreed without argument, which told me, more than anything she could have said, how frightened she had become underneath the performance of vacation photos and sunset captions. They flew home 2 days later, and I arranged for all of us to meet at my house this time, not theirs, because I had learned something important in the weeks since that dinner at their dining table. The room where hard truths get spoken matters. I was done sitting in chairs that had always belonged to someone else's comfort. Elias Cho joined us that evening, calm and precise in the way people become when they've spent years watching schemes like this one unfold and collapse. He laid out, methodically, what his investigation had already confirmed in the short time since I'd sent him the file. Marcus Doyle had run at least 2 prior developments under different company names, both collapsing under similar circumstances, both leaving investors with renderings and promises instead of deeds and permits. Halloway Coastal Developments did not legally exist as a construction firm in any jurisdiction relevant to the project. The resort Kayla had invested in was not behind schedule. It had never existed at all, beyond a website and a set of drone footage licensed from an entirely different, unrelated property 4 islands away. I watched my sister's face while Elias spoke, and I want to tell you honestly, there was no satisfaction in it for me, none of the vindication I might have imagined feeling weeks earlier. There was only a tired, aching sadness, watching someone I loved absorb the full weight of how thoroughly she had been used. My father asked, his voice rough, what came next, whether any of the money could actually be recovered. Elias explained that a formal fraud complaint, filed jointly, with the documentation I had already compiled, gave them a real chance at partial recovery, and that more importantly, my findings had already been quietly shared with 2 other families who had reached out to his office independently after noticing similar red flags in their own investments, meaning this wasn't just going to help us. It was going to help stop the same scheme from finding its next set of victims. My father looked at me for a long moment across the room, and something in his face shifted, something I had never seen there before, not pride exactly, something closer to recognition, as though he were seeing me clearly for the first time in longer than either of us could measure. He said, quietly, we always thought you'd be fine. We never stopped to ask if fine was actually what you were. I told him that fine had never been a feeling. It had been a job, one I had been assigned without ever being asked if I wanted it, and that assuming I was fine had always been easier for everyone than actually checking. My mother started crying then, not the performative tears I had watched Kayla learn to produce over the years, but something rawer, something that looked, for the first time, like actual grief rather than manipulation. She said she had skipped my wedding not because Kayla mattered more, but because facing me, in that dress, on that day, while knowing what the trip was really for, had felt unbearable, and that flying away had felt, in the moment, easier than lying to my face. I told her that flying away had not spared me the lying. It had only delayed it, and made it worse, because I had spent my wedding day making up kinder explanations for their absence than the real one ever deserved. We sat with that truth for a long time, all of us, in a living room that had never held a conversation this honest before. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody stormed out. It was, strangely, the calmest difficult conversation my family had ever had, precisely because everyone had finally run out of softer versions of the truth to hide behind. Before they left that night, I told them how things would work going forward. The trust would remain under my full authority, with any future distribution requiring documented purpose and my direct approval, not as punishment, but because fairness, real fairness, the kind my grandmother had actually intended, required transparency none of us had practiced in years. I told them I loved them, and that I meant it, but that I would no longer be available as the family's unpaid safety net, the person who quietly absorbed whatever needed absorbing so the peace could stay unbroken on the surface. I told them I was still their daughter. I was simply no longer willing to be their unpaid insurance policy. My father nodded slowly and said that was fair. My mother, still crying softly, said she wanted to understand how to be better, and asked if family counseling might help, not because a lawyer or an investigator had suggested it, but because she had realized, finally, sitting in my living room, that honesty was a skill their family had never actually learned, only avoided. Kayla stayed after everyone else had gone. She sat across from me at my kitchen table, the same table where I had first added up $41,000 in a column with a pen from the drawer by the stove, and she said, quietly, that she was going to start paying back what she could, slowly, whatever it took, not because I was demanding it, but because she wanted, for the first time in her life, to be someone I didn't have to worry about. I told her I didn't need her to pay me back to be forgiven. I told her what I actually needed was for her to ask me things, sometimes, instead of only calling when something had already gone wrong. She laughed, a small, watery laugh, and said that might take practice, and I told her that was all right, we had time now, more time than we'd ever actually used honestly before. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected recovery to feel. There were no dramatic reversals, no perfect endings tied up in a single conversation. My parents started counseling, slowly, imperfectly, the way real change usually happens. Some of the trust money was recovered through Elias's investigation, not all of it, but enough to matter, enough to prove that looking closely at something painful can sometimes save more than just yourself. Kayla began sending small payments each month, alongside longer texts than she'd ever sent me before, texts that weren't emergencies, just updates, just her, checking in. And then there was David. I want to tell you about the evening, 6 weeks after that dinner, when he asked me to meet him after work at an address I didn't recognize, gave no explanation, only asked me to trust him, and something in the way he said it made me say yes without hesitation, which tells you, I think, everything about how far we'd come since a folded note in a garment bag 2 years earlier. The address turned out to be the site of the very first building we had ever worked on together, years before we were married, back when I was a junior engineer and he was a young architect assigned to the same restoration project, back when our entire relationship had started over shared coffee and disagreements about load-bearing walls that neither of us actually wanted to win. The building had long since been renovated into a small community space, but David had arranged, quietly, without telling me a single detail, for us to have the rooftop for one evening, string lights he'd hung himself, badly, unevenly, in a way that made me love it more than if it had been professionally done, and a small table set with exactly 2 chairs. He told me he'd been holding on to something since before our wedding day, a folder he had quietly built and never mentioned, labeled, half-joking at the time, Plan B, filled with small backup ideas in case anything ever went wrong on our actual wedding day. He said he had never expected to need it, and when the day came and my parents didn't show, he had watched me hold myself together so completely that he hadn't wanted to add anything else to that day's weight, so he had kept the folder, quietly, waiting for the right moment instead. He said this rooftop, this building, this exact spot where we had once argued for 40 minutes about a support column neither of us had been entirely right about, was the version of our wedding day he had always wanted to give me, one built entirely out of things that belonged only to us, no empty chairs, no missing anyone, just the 2 of us and the beginning of everything. We renewed our vows that night, small, unofficial, deeply specific, full of private references only 2 engineers who fell in love over blueprints could possibly understand. I cried, but not the timed, contained crying of a bathroom stall at a reception. I cried openly, easily, the way you cry when there is finally nothing left underneath the tears except joy. I have thought a great deal, since that night, about what makes a family. I used to believe it was owed automatically, simply by blood, simply by the accident of being born into a particular house. I don't believe that anymore. I believe now that family is built the same way a structure is built, deliberately, with attention, with load-bearing choices made again and again over time, not assumed, not inherited, chosen. Months after that rooftop evening, my mother called me on an ordinary Tuesday, no crisis attached to the call at all, and asked, hesitantly, almost shyly, if she could come by for dinner sometime soon, just to talk. I said yes. I want you to understand what that yes cost me and what it gave me in equal measure, because saying yes to my mother again did not mean forgetting what had happened. It meant choosing, deliberately, to see if something honest could actually be built on top of what had broken. I hung up the phone that evening, and I stood by my kitchen window for a long time, the same window where I had once sat with cold coffee and a legal pad, adding up a number that changed everything, and I thought about the woman I had been on my wedding day, standing in a barn with 2 empty chairs in the front row, believing that understanding was the same thing as love. I know now that it isn't. I know now that being loved means being asked, not assumed, chosen, not simply expected to understand. I got a smaller family out of all of this, quieter, more honest, harder one, and a marriage built by a man who filled empty spaces before I even knew I needed them filled, and I would not trade that trade for anything the old, easier version of my life once offered me. If this story meant something to you, if any part of it reminded you of your own empty chairs, your own quiet understanding that cost you more than anyone ever noticed, I'd love for you to stay with me. Subscribe, so you're here for the next story, because there is always another one, another family, another quiet reckoning waiting to be told, and I promise you, every single time, someone finally stops absorbing the silence and starts asking why.